Okay, welcome back, everybody. Hope you enjoyed lunch. To kick us off this afternoon is Galano, co-founder of Infura. A bit louder, please. And he's going to talk about reshaping the world of Web3 with Infura, of course.
All right, thank you. All right, thank you. Hello, everybody. It's great to be back here. So, my name's Iji, and today I wanted to talk to you about what we're doing at Infura. This is a big week for our ecosystem. I always like coming back to Berlin during Berlin Blockchain Week, DappCon, ETH Berlin. Like, there's so much history of Ethereum here. And especially with this week being historic with the merge, I thought it was good to talk about the history of Infura, a little bit about the impact on Ethereum, the Web3 ecosystem, and the growth of Web3. And especially dApps, because this is DappCon, and we should be talking about dApps. So my story is I started out my career at a small startup in California. We were doing video game streaming. I was there for a few years before we got acquired by Sony. I was doing some back-end engineering, a lot of like DevOps, automation type of work, a lot of stuff that was like back-end infrastructure. And I bounced around to a couple of other startups, and in 2015, a friend of mine at that startup said, he came up to me during lunch and asked me a question about if you had a compute problem and you wanted somebody else to solve it, and you wanted to then have them give that back to you and like prove the result, prove that they did it correctly, like how would you do it? And the first thought that I had was, are you leaving? Like, where are you interviewing? Like, this sounds like an interview question. And he said, no, this is like, have you looked at this Ethereum thing? It's amazing, like, it has smart contracts. I'm like, what's a smart contract? And he said, you need to look at this thing. And so I looked, and it blew my mind. And he introduced me to Joe Lubin and Consensus, and I ended up working very soon after that on things within Consensus, met a couple of great people, and we started Infura together. So in 2016, we started Infura, and as we were looking around the ecosystem at like what you could do, it was early 2016. There really wasn't much at the time. Everybody was still trying to tinker around and see what is it that you could do with smart contracts, what could be done with Ethereum, what are the ways that people want to interact with smart contracts, and this is a screenshot from EtherDelta. This isn't like the earliest version. This is the screenshot I could still find. But like, this is what a DEX looked like at the time, right? This is what we would look at and say, all right, how are we going to interact with a smart contract? And it was very straightforward. It was a simple UI interacting with a smart contract. And then here's another example. Some of you might remember EtherRoll, where you would send a transaction and basically bet on the outcome of a dice roll. There's some drama in like the end history of EtherRoll that you can read about, but like for this, we'll just focus on like the technical aspect of this was smart contract provable fair dice roll on Ethereum. And here's a very simple interface that anybody can check out the code, look at, prove that it's all legit, and then you can run that. Like that was at the time that I started in the Ethereum space, and I think most of the people that I started in Infura with started in this space. This is what the state of the ecosystem was. Maybe you could also like buy a pixel on the Million Ether homepage and things like that. But you have the user interacting with a simple interface, and whether that was a command line interface or a web app like this, it was interacting with that smart contract on the blockchain through the blockchain node connection, and many of us were running our own Ethereum clients or blockchain clients at the time. The thing that was important to a lot of us was the decentralized ethos of making sure that this is living on-chain, verifiable, and trustless. And then there was also this IPFS component that people started to use as decentralized storage or decentralized data, so that you can take that front end, put it on an IPFS host or server, and make it so that somebody could use this standard HTTP gateway and interface with the smart contract through a web browser or ideally in the future, use an IPFS client. We at Infura started to run an IPFS hosting service where you could pin that data, and it was supposed to be a gateway and a transition path so that we could get people thinking in Web 2, transitioning to Web 3. And that's pretty much always been the ethos of Infura, is thinking Web 2, transition to Web 3. So with IPFS, you start with HTTP gateway, transition to understanding the IPFS protocol, understanding decentralized data and how to retrieve it, and then build the optimal and ideal solution once you've proven, yes, this works. When you think about the components of a dApp, there's that front end, and then there's the smart contract that lives on the blockchain. And what people started to do around like maybe late 2016, early 2017 for sure, was they started to add this additional component that I've circled here, which is adding a backend server. And the reason that they did that was for things that if you're a developer sound pretty obvious, for caching, for query optimization, and an overall better user experience. When you think about how blockchain clients store data and how they were designed, they were meant to store data in a way that it's provable and verifiable. And the data constructs that go into how the data is stored meant that it was really difficult to pull the data out. And we've done other talks, and I'm sure a lot of other people here have seen some of the talks about how different Ethereum clients now store data to make it easier to pull that data out. But at the time, this is what people started to do, and this pattern still continues today, is somebody pulls that raw blockchain data, indexes it, so that they can optimize the queries that their dApp uses. But what this breaks is that ability to have interoperability with your own infrastructure. Like you're able to switch from one node to another, from one API provider to another because of that interoperability. When you start introducing this backend caching indexing layer, unless you're using something that's like an open decentralized network, that some of those now exist for indexing, this becomes a proprietary point that means your dApp is no longer really a dApp, at least in the form that we were talking about back then. The other thing that people started to do was they started to not run their own blockchain clients. They started to use Infura. Many applications, so if you've used MetaMask, if you've used a lot of the popular applications out there, that if you're not running your own node, you're connecting through Infura. And what we did was we said that we wanted to help the user adoption of Ethereum. We knew that from the beginning we were starting a centralized service, but we said our goal as Infura was not to solve a decentralized problem initially, because the decentralized solution at the time already existed. It was run your own node. Like that was the decentralized solution at the time. And we said we're going to try to make it as easy as possible for people to get that data themselves through our API and see what the trade-off is. Is anyone actually going to find value in this? And I remember going to conferences and our team going to conferences and talking about what we were doing. And people would ask those questions, like, but isn't this against the ethos? Isn't this against decentralization? And we said, no, because it's interoperable. What we want to build is something that's interoperable with running your own node, so you can switch to us and switch back. We're just trying to make it easier for people to get started, because if they wanted to try Etherroll, or they wanted to try making their own version that was better, and there was that extra barrier to entry, additional friction, they might just give up and say, I'm going to do something else. Maybe at the time they were equally interested in ML or AI or something else. And we said, let's make it as easy as possible for the brightest and smartest people to try experimenting in this space. And then if they find value, we'll find a way to decentralize in the future. So that was the choice that we made. We said we wanted to bring more users. It was a conscious choice that we made, and we said, yes, we're going to be centralized. We're going to optimize for bringing users into the space, bringing developers into the space. And a lot of the applications out there started to make a similar choice. They said, we want more users to be able to interact with this. Maybe they were driven by just like wanting users. Maybe they were driven by like the value that was created for themselves and their team by bringing more users. But people started optimizing for adoption. So you can look, I'm now talking about that like 2017 era. People were optimizing for the adoption of make it as simple as possible to use their application, do the heavy lifting, so that for us that meant run the blockchain nodes, run the blockchain clients, so that you provide this API that people interact with. And the thing about it was the centralized versus decentralized choice. Some people were aware of the choices that they were making. Other people were just putting out a fire and doing whatever they could to like solve the specific problem at hand. And I'm talking about like the Ico Craze in 2017. We had engineering teams reaching out to us saying, we were running our own nodes for this, and our ICO is like in the middle of the sale. The sale's going for like 2 more hours. Can you help us? And we would say, sure. Like, we would get woken up in the middle of the night by teams saying, can you help us run our infrastructure? And then we would open up our endpoint. At the time, we didn't have a paid service like we do today. It was just fully like a public good that we provided to the ecosystem. But when you look at what happened during that phase, this is something I pulled from the Reddit cryptocurrency subreddit, where it shows about $6.5 or $6.3 billion that were raised in 2017 through ICOs. So look at all of that value that flowed into the ecosystem, for better or worse into certain projects, but flowed into the ecosystem. And imagine what this would have looked like if you said, hold on, before you can actually participate in this ecosystem, before you can like put $10 into this crowd sale, you have to go to this website, understand what a node is, understand how to download it, install it, wait a couple of days to potentially a week for it to sync. Some people might do that, but there's no denying that that extra friction hurts adoption and will put a limit on the adoption of the technology. So it's understandable that people, especially maybe if they were funded by investors, had to make decisions that were best for scaling for user adoption. Rewinding a little bit, the choices that we made when we started Infura in 2016 were, yes, we agree we're going to be centralized when we start this thing out, but we're going to progressively decentralize in the future. We'll just keep trying to solve the problems as they're put in front of us, and then we're going to find a way to decentralize as things go on. The 2 key functions that we provide as Infura are read and write. It's very simple. It's reading and interacting with the blockchain data, and it's actually propagating transactions to the network. That's like the core function of Infura, and it's also served by the Ethereum node. So many users that we've had over the years not just use us, but they'll also use their own infrastructure, or they'll potentially use another API provider. Node providers now are popular because what we do is not run a bunch of nodes behind a load balancer. Like, there are fantastic clients out there: Aragon, Nethermine, Go Ethereum, Besu. I don't want to leave any specific ones out. The Parity client was amazing and turned into the Open Ethereum client. There's a lot of things that were done there to try to optimize within the client itself. But within computer science and like the developer space, there's a limit to what you can do with a single node, and then it's inevitable that you start trying to do things to scale the traffic. First, you do things horizontally, and you say, I'm not going to run 1, I'm going to run 2, and then 20, and then you put a load balancer in front of it, and it's a very straightforward scaling solution. But the problem with blockchain clients is each of these things have their own database, and that your requests get routed in between them, and they're all slightly out of sync. And so centralized providers like Infura end up building custom microservices and proprietary code to do that indexing into traditional databases, to be able to detect when a request needs to be routed one way or another so that people get a consistent user experience. And that's not something that is trivial to reproduce. That was something that solved the read problem for getting access to the blockchain data. But then on the other side of that is the write problem. So transaction fees, this one's showing 2018, started to go up because of additional traffic on the network and ICOs and things during that phase. But then you go forward another couple of years to 2020, and that 2018 peak is just like a little little tiny hill next to this massive mountain of transaction fee growth that happened in DeFi summer. I mentioned that because going back, when we were in this phase of 2018, this was just talking about Ethereum. Like, there were other networks that are starting to come out there and were kind of in their infancy, but Infura didn't choose to start supporting those. It was a little too early for us to really decide how we were going to approach that. But once we got to 2020, it was pretty clear that this was a problem that was hurting adoption. And so what we said we were going to do was go multi-chain. We said that as the developer tool that many people in the ecosystem used, we needed to support the chains that developers wanted. Like, it didn't matter like if we favored one chain or another. It didn't matter what the technical merits of one were over another. If developers had an interest in deploying their applications to a new chain, we should be able to offer that as an option to them. And so now you can look at this list of chains that we now support. I can't even remember the number in my head. It used to be easy. I used to be able to say, oh, it's 2, now it's 4. Like, we'll have to count those boxes. But there are many EVM compatible and now non-EVM compatible chains that we support on Infura. And over 40%, now nearly half of our users don't just use Ethereum or don't just, they'll also be using a layer 2 or another like EVM compatible network. And about a fifth of our users use multiple layer 2s. So let's go back to this previous diagram of what the dApp used to look like. This was very simple. You can see how you could make this pure and decentralized. You can say, I'm a user, I'm going to put my UI on IPFS, and I'm going to run my own blockchain node. But how does that work now when it's a multi-chain dApp? Were you aware that now that's a lot more difficult, and was it a conscious choice that you made when you were developing your dApp? So if you now built this dApp that interfaces with Polygon, Arbitrum, Optimism, several other chains, it works. It works great. Your users are getting extremely low fees and a lot of optionality in their choices. But now if they said, and you might say, my UI is open source, you can run it yourself if you want to, this is now the requirement that you have to be able to make that match what this initial intent of that pure dApp was from back in like 2016. Is somebody here willing to run an Optimism, Arbitrum, et cetera, like node, like 5, 6 different blockchain nodes, light clients or not light clients? It's going to be a challenge, right? And it's something that hurts adoption and usability. So that's something that I wanted to highlight, was that when we're optimizing for user adoption, we said we're making it simple, we're doing the heavy lifting, and we're making those intentional choices about whether we're centralized or decentralized. When you're building your dApps, whether you're building them at one of the hackathons this coming week or just as part of your product, all of the things that we should be doing as an ecosystem is making sure that the choices that we make are well-intentioned and deliberate. The dApp complexity is inherent centralization. As dApps get more complex, as we introduce the concept of multiple protocols and bridges and other things, MEV protection, it introduces this centralization to the dApp design. So for Infura's evolution, we want to be more intentional about how we approach this. We had said in the beginning that we're going to be centralized, focus on solving a specific problem, and increase the adoption of the ecosystem. We feel like we've gotten to that point. We've gotten to the point where adoption of the ecosystem is now sustainable, and not just by us. There are many other players in the ecosystem that provide value to developers. And so at ETH Berlin this coming Friday, we're going to be talking about the next evolution of Infura, which is how we're going to continue to approach on that, this progressive decentralization problem. Starting with some things like something as simple as being able to sign in with your wallet like MetaMask might seem like an obvious one, but it's a significant change if you just include that type of design into your application. I also wanted to invite you to come and celebrate the merge with us. Like I said, it's a big week for all of us in the ecosystem, so we're having a merge party this Thursday. Sounds like there's a lot of merge parties this Thursday, but it's also our chief researcher, Pat McCory's birthday. If anyone was able to check out his workshop this past Sunday, Patrick's awesome. It's a 2-for-1 special with Patty's birthday. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Does someone have questions? We've got 2 mics in the room. Just raise your hand. If not, since we went a bit over time, I'm just going to thank you again.
All right.
Hope you have a great
Thanks,
party
everyone.
on Thursday.